Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Center Stage and the second Water and Communications panel of the week. This evening we're going to be discussing science in the storm, who to trust when facts are under attack. We do have the Grinnforce Foundation to thank for making water and communications possible during the World Water Week. And so I'd request all of you to join us at 3:30 after the session at the Grinnforce Lounge outside the exhibition area to have a short mingle and talk about the water and communications panels. To join us on stage to discuss these issues, we have Maria Hold, Senior Communications and Impact Officer at Stockholm Environment Institute, and a dear colleague. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
We have Brad Mogridge, Professor and Associate Dean, Indigenous Leadership at the University of Technology at Sydney. And last but not least, we have Dr. Martina Klimas, Senior Manager and Advisor of Peace at CIVI. So I'm going to start with you, Maria, because we spoke a little bit before this panel. And this is an area that needs a lot of unpacking because it's quite diverse, it's quite broad, but it comes down to a key number of areas for discussion. And you said in the last 5 years, we've seen a huge change in communications. We've seen a huge change in the role of communicators. We've seen a huge amount of pressure being put on researchers to deal with all of these different elements coming together at once. We touched upon the fact that social media and TikTok are running elections. Democracy has changed. Democratic processes have changed. So I want to ask you, with all of this information, and with your work at the intersection of research and communication, what do you see being the role of communicators at this time? And how can we take forward the discussion when there is this much noise around it?
So I think it's important to recognize that there's a lot of changes both in communication and in the world at large. And researchers and communicators have a very important role to play at this point in time, but we also need to do things a bit differently compared to how it might have worked in the past. So a lot of people are, of course, very confused about all these changes, and not only about technology and so on, but all the other changes that we see in the world as well, like pandemics and wars and all sorts of things that are very unsettling. And of course, there's a lot of people out there who want to offer very easy explanations and a lot of conspiracy theories and deepfakes and so on. So it's hard to navigate, and it's hard for people to know who to trust. So researchers can have an important role to play, really, by just clarifying what is known, by hopefully pivot their research agenda a little bit to also be able to answer new things and follow unfolding crisis and emerging trends and interlinkages between the technology and nature degradation and geopolitical shifts and what have you. But for them to be able to do that, they also need more support from communicators. Because if they do that, then they can sort of explain why things are happening, what is going on, and also what we can do about it. So sort of create this sense of agency that we really, really need at this point in time. But it's hard to do that because you're also competing with all those other people who also want to explain things and have social media followings that researchers can only dream of, or influencers are usually also have fun and really easy explanations for things that researchers struggle to explain in very, very complicated ways. So it's no wonder that many people sort of prefer the knowledge they can get from social media personality, for example, because it's much easier to understand. And social media algorithms definitely will prefer very easy explanations, especially if they're linked to a lot of emotions, like a moral outrage or something. So that's something that researchers have to compete with in a way that we're not used to. They didn't used to be that way. So communicators sort of need to work together with researchers in developing storytelling and messaging and metaphors, visuals, and so on, that are also based in research about how people understand messages, how people form opinions, what it is that make us act, or what it is that makes it difficult sometimes for people to understand scientific language, because it tends to be quite different from how we speak in everyday life. So all sorts of things are new challenges, and we need to work together in a new way, I think, researchers and communicators, to tackle that.
And they have to come together because, of course, the frameworks have changed. Mm-hmm. Your audience has changed. The way in which to get to your audience has changed. Exactly. And you say who to trust. Mm-hmm. And I want to come to you, Martina, because we can also use, this can also be used or abused to deeply polarize a conversation, deeply politicize a conversation. And Maria's touched upon it. The little that you know is enough to form an opinion. And that opinion might need more information, but of course social media and the different media landscapes we have now give you what little you need to know to put you in a certain camp. So I'm going to ask you, when it comes to the role of communicators in today's world, what can we do to actually minimize the abuse, let's say, of information and the polarization that can be caused by misinformation?
Thank you for this question, Arati, and I would like to really thank Grundfors for supporting these discussions on this very important issue, and also thank CIVI. We've been working with this for quite some time at CIVI, and we started coining a strategy that we call communication resilience. And that means that we actually work on a space to provide support for governments who usually work on more technical issues, on the water line, climate issues, and they came to us and they said, we really don't know how to communicate about it. And this is often deprioritized. There are not enough resources. And just to think about it, to create the disinformation content, it costs so little if you compare how much it costs to create the real content, because there you have to do trial and error, you have to invest in studies, you have to work with different sectors. So that is incomparable how much you then only can invest in creating this information. And we found out, the study says that disinformation across the world costs about $78 billion annually. This is how much it costs in different sectors, not only climate and water, but it has immense costs. And from where we come from, CIVI perspective, we really do need to work with governments on helping them to understand how their action can minimize the space in which disinformation thrives. And that means that to really think about transparency, and here we talk about very difficult issues. It's very difficult to communicate that we will have to change, for example, our agriculture policies. We will really have to change the way how we use water. We will have to conserve water. And many of this, in many countries, we will have to introduce policies that we will have to start paying more for water. This is very unpopular. And to create disinformation content on this and to weaponize it against governments, it's so easy. And then you can really achieve a lot, not only to undermine the water sector, but also, for example, create political instability. And so I think from our perspective, and where communicators can really play a role, is to work with different government actors who are more on the technical side and help them understand the importance of communication, maybe develop tools that can be used, and also work with scientists on simplifying the messages, but simplifying them in a way that we still are true to the core, but it is accessible for wider audience.
So I'm going to ask you a quick follow-up, Martina, because of course, this seems very intuitive. Yeah. And if you look at what Maria is saying, is that the forums in which this information is now being accessed are multiplying. And in some ways, researchers and communicators are not, I'm asking, aware of all the forums that are available that you need to put the information into. So when you develop these tools, how do you, if I can ask, actually find out where are the forums? Where is everyone? Where are the new influencers? Where are the new communicators? Who is actually getting the benefit of this 78 billion market of disinformation?
I think it is really being used by political oppositions, by different countries, by different lobby groups. We see, for example, that also disinformation spreads 70% faster than normal messages. So I think it's really knowing your market, knowing the right holders, knowing the stakeholders, and really understanding the impacts. And don't underestimate communication. Don't underestimate the value. It's not just something you add on as like the, something nice to have. It really should be at the core of all the planning. And just small note, because here in this World Water Week, we talk about a lot about the global conferences. And COPs are very much targeted by different disinformation campaigns. And now the current, the future incoming presidency in Brazil, they actually made an effort. And there was a meeting between governments and NGOs on how to mitigate the space and how to really watch that the results and the process is not undermined by these efforts. So we do see some progress, and we do things that are happening, but I think we all need to see how we can contribute.
And so the space is increasing, but of course also stakeholders are coming to space and wanting to engage in different ways. And Brad, that brings me to you. Of course, we've had that during the week now, the World Water Week, is how do we engage in an effective way with Indigenous communities? And you've made the point that Indigenous communities are seen as a really nice to have, but also rejected in other ways in different conversations where there is disinformation or misinformation. So I'm going to ask you, you've heard what Maria and Martina have said in terms of the challenges that we're facing as communicators. How do you walk the line to create the balance that you're, in terms of Indigenous knowledges, are seen as equals, and you're not having to build that challenge and that barrier? How do you break down those walls?
I think definitely my privilege where I am having, being in the academic space now, but, going through university and also having your Indigenous heritage and knowledge that you connect with while you're on your own traditional lands, I think is looking at ways to bring them together. That's an opportunity. And I think when it comes to engagement, Indigenous people are heavily engaged, but sometimes we want to get married. I suppose that builds up the opportunity, and we can have a honeymoon and all that sort of stuff. So, but I think that opportunity to influence, we've just got to keep, for Indigenous scholars especially in this space, we've got to keep providing evidence, publishing papers, and then you can, take the stage and tell your story, and then provide ways forward. And yeah, just recently published a paper with 7 other Indigenous scholars. Tara McAllister was the lead author, and we got it published in Nature. So I suppose that influence is moving in the right direction. And we're looking at decolonising science institutions. We gave them suggested 8 principles to do that. And yeah, it was all about decolonising, but also don't just diversify them. So it's sort of going to that next level. I think that is our opportunities to fill that void with Indigenous knowledge. And so we definitely are seen as storytellers, and sometimes that storytelling is put into myth and legend or fiction, not real, but what Indigenous knowledge is and connections to place and understanding place and observing place is a scientific method, and it gets to a point where you've ultimately survival. And for Australian Indigenous people, we're the driest inhabited continent on Earth. We have extremes, and Indigenous people have survived those extremes. There are stories that talk about adapting and moving to higher land when the sea levels started to rise at the end of the last ice age. So, that evidence is still there. I'm
going to ask you actually, in terms of the factors you addressed, in terms of taking the stage, in terms of writing the papers, in terms of creating that sound, I'm going to be provocative.
Yeah.
These are traditional ways of taking the stage. These are the ways in which Maria's communicators and researchers 10 years ago were doing. And now, of course, the forums have enlarged. The room for misunderstanding, miscommunication, rewriting the stories of myth and legend that you talk about have also enlarged.
Yep.
How do Indigenous communities and that knowledge community work to influence these new spaces that, of course, Martina and Maria have alluded to?
Yeah, I think it's when you're offered that opportunity, you turn up and you deliver. And then if you're backed by research and evidence, and I suppose the papers you're publishing, you're in a informed position. So that's that free, prior, and informed consent. Me as a researcher, if you're in that space, and I can say what I want as long as I'm backed up by my research. So, I think that's the opportunity ahead. And if for Indigenous people, we in the Australian context, we don't really see many kids going into science and or even science communication. But when it comes down to it, storytelling is a form of science communication. And I think if we have one of the oldest storytellers on the planet, providing opportunity and advice, then I think that's a good thing. And that disinformation is there. So we've had a number of responses to our Nature paper in the negative. So that's fine. You don't want to click it because you don't want to give them that joy of someone clicking on their bit of rubbish.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
it's exactly that. The communicator becomes a target. The researcher becomes a target. Maria, that brings me to you, because in terms of the practicalities, the toolkit we have to give communicators and researchers, you are the target of online hostility. You are the target of basically people trolling you. And how do you equip these researchers? How do you equip the communicators to work together to say, as Brad has touched upon, don't click it. Don't feed the fire. Actually, here are strategies. You might be infuriated by what you see, but there are ways to handle it to calm the fire. How are you working with that?
So I think actually, before going into that, I think it's also important that you always remember that what you see on social media trends are not real. They're not representative of how people really are thinking about things. So we know that scientists, for example, remain one of the most trusted professions. We know that people want policy to be influenced by science or based in science. We know that there was this poll last year with people in, I think it was 77 countries or something, and 80% wanted the governments to act more against climate change. So what we see on social media is not representative, and it's sort of like good to sort of have that in mind. Then still we see also that science is under attack. We see that there are a lot of harassment online, and it's really hard to sort of know how to deal with that, because as you're saying, you sort of feed in the fire right there. At the same time, you also want to debunk things. You also don't want to just leave the story out there, because you also want to present another view. So you need to sort of not go into like sort of letting the narrative be driven by trolls, say, but also to, in some way or form, explain your version of it, but you can't just keep feeding it. But I think it's also important just that we sort of understand how this works and what is going on, so that researchers can be more mentally prepared, and that we can sort of support each other when people are like harassed online, for example. So understanding like what Martina was talking about ahead of every COP, that we see all these attempts to sort of like undermine the credibility of climate research or climate researchers. And by now we know that, we've seen the pattern. We know that it's both driven by fossil fuel lobbyists. We see that it's increasingly becoming something that politicians do, like for the far right, it's more and more common to try to put climate research into question, or how do I say that it's not so important, then it's like something that we can derail and do later. So to be aware of those things, and also that different people are more likely to become harassed online, depending on if you're a woman, if you're a transgender, if you're a person of color, and so on, you're more at risk than others, and to sort of step up for each other and support each other. I think that is very, very important.
I want to take what Maria's saying, because you're very transparent when you go online. You're very vulnerable when you go online. All of these kind of hostilities, these attacks, are not to an abstract. They're very personal to you. And Martina, now you're working, of course, on peace and conflict. And you also talk about the politicization, the polarization of information. Maria's touched upon some of the tools we can give researchers, we can give communicators, but you are under the microscope in a very different way. So how do we mitigate these actions? How do you work with, as Brad touched upon, your story is out there. How do you actually work with the communication, the pushback that you get against that story, to not feel harassed, to engage, and to provide, as Maria says, what we're looking for, the real information in a way that's understood by the audience, that is also changing?
I think I would start by saying that I do think that we need to engage the tech giants in this conversation, because they are the ones who ultimately control the algorithm and who are actually curating the space where all this happens. So I would love to see them at the World Water Week. I would love to see them here next year with us discussing this issue, because they do need to understand that climate and water issues are existential issues of all of us. It's not a matter of political opinion. And I personally, I don't put much out there about some type of work I do, just because I don't want. It's not that I do not want to be transparent. It's just that it's not mature enough to be under this microscope. And what we see often when we work in negotiations on shared water resources, that negotiators are feeling that their hands are really tight because they are so dependent on the public opinion, and that is so influenced by these different streams of, often it can also be misinformation. It's not malicious, it's not designed to be deceiving, but it's just, the issue is so complex, so there's a lot of misunderstanding. And then we also do have the targeted disinformation campaigns. So we also need to understand that it's so difficult for negotiators, for water and climate negotiators to operate in this space, because then it's also affected like the public opinion, and that's why we see so little will to actually reach a decision or actually reach an agreement, because agreement, one always has to compromise. And often we hear in the back doors or back channels, we would agree on this, but we are so worried what they would say at home. And you know, we do have some examples with different water agreements that in one instance actually the person who signed it was later executed, because it's so sensitive, it's so polarized. So and my answer is, again, work very much with those different types of actors and think about how we can all support each other, and also communicate about the complexity of this problem and try to really help everyone understand that we are all in this together. It's not really that it's one group against the other, but it's really we are trying to find a solution space for all of us.
I mean, in some ways what you're saying, Martina, is that with this, not fear, but with this kind of hesitation that you also have about sharing things under the microscope actually shrinks the space for negotiation, and the people that don't have that hesitation take over in terms of having the conversation. So Brad, you mentioned algorithm, Martina, so I've got to come to you now in terms of algorithms, because we haven't touched upon the role that data and AI play here, and how that's one of these kind of stakeholders that is misunderstood or maybe overlooked in terms of how that can shape the communication. When it comes to indigenous knowledge, indigenous communities, how do you protect them from what happens when AI can cause deflection of information or misinformation?
Yeah, that's a good question, but I suppose it's, when you think about AI, is that Aboriginal intelligence or artificial? Aboriginal intelligence is the good one, but I think AI is a real challenge because it's in every part of your life now, and especially academia. It's everywhere. It's a tool now used by students and lecturers, and so I suppose it's, do you play the game with it to use it for your advantage? But I suppose it's making sure that you, because AI is now, in Australia we have about 250 to 300 languages, indigenous languages, and AI is making up words for those languages. So you need to be very careful about those sort of aspects. So if there's not a word for that, in a traditional language, AI can make it up. So that's sort of happening right now. And I think if you're engaging with communities to do a project, you know, you're going along those processes and following protocols and getting to a point where you've got a research agreement, and it's ultimately that research agreement and also the trust of that community that's built. I think Colleen mentioned on day one, in the Indigenous session, around trust, or tea, cups of tea. I have the 3 T's. So it's trust over time, over cups of tea. So, you know, you can build that, and if you're getting to a point where you're starting to build some research, build a Indigenous research methodology, they are part of that. And I think it's that evidence that comes out of that project that will be AI free, you know what I mean? So you're building real knowledge that can influence policy. That's the ultimate aim of part of science, is that if you're got evidence, it can influence policy, and then hopefully it influences legislation, and then, you know, ultimately if people don't sort of follow that legislation, then obviously you've got regulation that can come in as well with a big stick. But, you know, that's sort of the last straw. You want to make sure that you have every point along the way to allow communities to own their knowledge and always maintain that. If they do not own their knowledge, or sometimes they've been burnt before and they'll tell you to go away. So, you've got to make sure that you do it right from the start. And being an Indigenous scholar, or a researcher, you have to make sure you do it right, or otherwise, it gets on that grapevine and that works faster than any fibre optic network. Your name will be mud if you do the wrong thing. So yeah, we've got that integrity we've got to try and protect as well.
So I'm actually going to ask Martina and Maria a question, Brad, based on what you're saying, because own the knowledge is critical. And you mentioned AI free, though you are reclaiming AI, and I think we should stand behind that. I think it's, how do we actually have rules of engagement where all stakeholders are equal? Because the process that you've talked about, Brad, in terms of creating that knowledge on the ground, owning that knowledge, taking it away from like an AI-free product, how do you replicate that? How do you scale that in terms of how do we actually give this tool as a rule of engagement to other parties who are building information? I'm going to ask Maria to respond to that, and Martina, because we want to create spaces for peace. We don't want to create more information to create conflict and polarization. And I think Brad's given us a tool, but is that tool very site-specific, or can you see ways in which we can replicate this tool? Martina, I'm going to start with you.
I think I will look at this from the perspective of, again, dialogues around water. And I think there is important to really build connection between people and trust. And may sound like a cliche, but it's really that the people would know each other and they have each other's contacts across borders, and they can check. They say, oh, I've seen this news. This came up in this WhatsApp group. Is this true? And then if they really know each other and they gradually build trust, the other party can say, no, that's actually not true. We are not doing this. And we've seen that in many instances. We've been, for example, doing this also across journalists from different, within a basin, very sensitive basin, when they can check this news story came out. Is this true? And then the journalist from the other country would say, no, actually, this is unconfirmed source. So it's also investing into building these networks and helping establish these human connections. And so they really know where is the phone number, because in basins where we work, the relations are very tense. People don't know each other. People don't have each other's phone number. But through these informal meetings that CV and many other organizations are organizing, we can really build this, and that can really mitigate impacts of this disinformation in this specific context.
I think that's really important, because you're coming back to ground truthing, putting the work to actually say, we build the trust, we connect, we create these networks. It's an interesting kind of backlash to AI, to what AI is trying to do, which is to anonymize a lot of this information, but you're saying that's actually the exact opposite of what we need to do. Maria, I'm going to ask you, because we started the discussion by saying everything's changed in the last 5 years. The ways in which researchers, communicators have to work is a little bit different to what it was before. It's made things much more difficult. It's made the work, as Martina says, a little bit more transparent, which makes it more personal in terms of attack. But it's provided tools in terms of how we can push back. And I think ground truthing that both Brad and Martina are talking about is one way. Projecting forward in the next 5 years, in the next 7 years, looking at this sphere of communication and how fast it's multiplying, what do you see we should be looking out for? What tools do you think we should be developing and preparing for the new breed of researchers and communicators that are coming up the ranks?
So I think what you both mentioned is like essential also from a communications perspective to ensure transparency. And an era of AI and deepfakes and so on, that is hard. So we must be also very clear about this is how we work. This is to what extent we are using AI, and for example, not allow AI manipulated images without that being very clearly stated. I think another aspect is also we need to get much better at having respectful conversations, learning how to listen to one another and listen in a way that we used to do in the pre-digital, as you were saying, having people's phone numbers, but also knowing how to listen to others and have conversations that don't increase polarization, but make sure that we listen to each other. I think that is the two main skills for everybody that we need to improve in the coming years.
So, Brad, I'm going to come to you with what Maria and Martina said, and of course, we've heard about the ways in which things are changing, the ways in which that we can create tools and mechanisms to push back. When it comes to research, of course, and when it comes to the work that Indigenous communities, Indigenous knowledge is now doing, it's growing. It's being understood in different ways, both negative and positive in terms of, as you mentioned, the pushback. How do you see the way forward in avoiding the buzzwords that can be used to say, we have this representative, we have this knowledge, we've included these points of view in our research, which is tokenism to some degree? And how do you create meaningful conversation and meaningful research where you aren't being seen as a buzzword integrating tool?
Yeah, that's a good one, because it's communities are used to researchers coming in and saying, I have a research question and we'd love you to help us answer it. And I suppose you could flip that around and start building that trust over time with cups of tea to then get the community to determine what their research question is. You know, that could be a way forward, you know, and I suppose that's part of what an Indigenous research methodology is working with those communities to build up their capacity. And, you know, I think there's a lot of science out there that is quite complex, but then how can the academies and science evolve to make sure that they go to communities with fit-for-purpose information that'll help them better understand their traditional lands? Like how, you know, that sort of aspect of, you know, it's almost flipping the whole research paradigm. Communities, you know, they want to see things going in circles, and rather than a straight line to a PhD, and then that PhD person goes away with all that knowledge, potentially. You know, that's happened in the past. And if it changes to those opportunities where the community is then the co-author and the co-presenter in conferences, so it's the idea of my own personal methodology is for my people, with my people, by my people. So, you know, that's just sort of a general motto, is that I'm trying to build evidence for them, so when they go into negotiations, they can bang it on the table like mining companies and industry, and sort of say, this is our evidence and this is our right to water, or this is our right to biodiversity. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm going to just, if I were to summarize in terms of the different conversations we've had here, I think, Brad, you say it very well. Own the knowledge, embed the knowledge, create trust, and actually create continuity. So there is no defection from the knowledge. And I think, Martina, what you touched about ground truthing is essential. Networking, getting to know your stakeholders and your communicators. In a world that is moving so fast, I think the kind of mechanisms you're giving us are really kind of back to basics. Don't let the AI confuse you. Don't let the media, multimedia forums confuse you. To own the knowledge actually takes these simple but very kind of exhaustive mechanisms on the ground. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like you to join me in giving them a warm hand of applause. Thank you so much.